The alarm horn cracked through the outpost before I even understood what it meant. I was small then, barely old enough to stand on my own 4 legs, and the sound went straight through my chest like a claw. My littermates froze around me in the creche pit, ears flat, eyes wide, the smell of fear thick in the air before any of us knew what we were afraid of. That sound only rang for one reason. Something had broken through the outer wall. I did not know, in that moment, that the next hour would decide what my people would believe for 1,000 years. I only knew that the adults were gone, the sky was dark with smoke, and the only grown creature left standing between us and the noise outside was a human named Nathan Cole. Let me take you back further, so you understand what he was to us before he became what he is now. My kind are called the Kareth. We are born predators, built for hunting, built for war, claws that can open steel, teeth that were never meant for anything but meat and enemies. We had lived that way for longer than our oldest songs could count, and we were proud of it. Strength was truth, strength was worth. A Kareth who could not fight was barely a Kareth at all. So when the humans arrived at our border world, small and soft and slow, most of my people did not know what to make of them. They had no claws worth mentioning. Their teeth were flat and useless for anything but chewing roots and grain. They walked upright on 2 thin legs, wrapped themselves in cloth because their skin could not survive a cold wind, and carried tools instead of weapons wherever they went. Our warriors called them the walking meat. Not cruelly, exactly, just honestly, the way you might describe a rabbit or a deer. Something the galaxy built to be eaten, not to hunt. Nathan Cole did not fit that picture, though none of us noticed it at the time. He came to our outpost as part of a trade agreement, one of many humans sent to help repair our failing water systems and power lines in exchange for safe passage through Kareth space. He was not a soldier. He was an engineer, quiet and steady, the kind of human who fixed things with his hands and rarely spoke unless someone spoke to him first. He had pale skin that reddened too easily under our sun, dark hair that he kept short, and eyes the color of old river stone. He was, by every measure my people used, unremarkable. But he was kind to us cubs, and that made him strange. Most adult Kareth ignored the creche, unless they were teaching us to fight, or scolding us for wandering too far. Nathan was different. He would sit near the edge of the pit while he worked on the water pumps, and sometimes he would talk to us, even though we were too young to answer him in words he understood. He would show us small tools, let us sniff the metal, laugh softly when one of us tried to bite a wrench because we thought it might be food. I remember the first time he gave me something. It was a smooth stone, polished by a river somewhere on his home world, cool and heavy in my small paw. He told me it was called a keepsake. I did not know that word. I only knew that no one had ever given me anything before that did not have a lesson attached to it. The warriors who guarded the outpost noticed him too, but not the way we cubs did. There was a Kareth named Draeth, one of the senior guards, who liked to mock Nathan whenever he passed. Draeth was tall even for our kind, with scars along his shoulder that he wore like medals, and he had no patience for anything that could not fight. I heard him once, standing over Nathan while the human knelt beside a broken pipe, tools spread across the ground. "You have no claws," Draeth said, his voice low and amused. "No fangs. No blooded name. Among my people, you would not even be counted as a person. You would be food that happened to be useful." Nathan did not look up from his work. He simply said, "That is fine. I am not trying to be counted as one of your people. I am trying to fix your water system before the cold season." Draeth laughed at that, the kind of laugh predators give when they think something is beneath their notice. He walked away without another word, and Nathan kept working as if nothing had happened at all. I did not understand then what I understand now. Among the Kareth, you are not truly someone until you have killed to protect the pack. That is how a person earns a name worth remembering. Cubs are given names, yes, but they are soft names, temporary names, waiting to be replaced by something earned in defense of others. A Kareth who never fights for their pack dies with a cub's name still hanging around their neck, and that is considered a quiet kind of shame. By that measure, Nathan Cole was nothing. He had no name worth keeping. He was, in the eyes of every warrior at that outpost, simply the meat that talked and fixed pipes. I did not think about any of this while I played beside the creche pit with my littermates, chasing insects in the dust, tumbling over each other the way cubs do. I did not think about it while Nathan taught me the word for stone, or while he wrapped a strip of cloth around my paw after I scraped it on a sharp rock. I only knew that when the older Kareth were busy, he was the one who made sure none of us wandered too close to the outer fence, the one who counted us twice before he let himself relax, the one who noticed if one of us went quiet or limped or stopped eating. None of us called that duty. We simply called it Nathan. The season was turning colder when the first warning came through the outpost's long-range sensors. A creature swarm, the kind that moved in packs across the open plains beyond our border, had been spotted 3 days out and closing. These were not Kareth. They were feral things, driven by hunger rather than thought, moving in numbers too large for a single patrol to handle. Our elders called an emergency muster. Every able warrior, every claw that could be spared, was pulled toward the defensive line at the edge of our territory. I remember the outpost that morning, the way the air itself seemed to hum with tension. Warriors moved in tight formations, checking blades and armor, calling orders back and forth in short-clipped bursts. Draith was among them, his scarred shoulder wrapped in fresh binding, his eyes sharp with the kind of hunger that only comes before a real fight. The creche was left with a smaller guard than usual. 2 young warriors, barely more than cubs themselves, were assigned to watch over us while the main force marched out. It should have been enough. No one expected the swarm to move as fast as it did, or to split, sending a smaller pack circling wide around the defensive line, straight toward the undefended side of the outpost, where the creche pit sat quiet and unaware. Nathan was there that morning too, working on a cracked support beam near the creche wall, his tools laid out in careful rows the way he always kept them. I remember him glancing up as the warriors marched past, watching them go with an expression I did not understand at the time. It was not fear exactly. It was something closer to worry, the kind you might see on the face of someone counting heads and coming up short. He asked one of the young guards a question before they left. I only caught pieces of it, my hearing still developing, my attention split between his voice and the game my littermates were playing nearby. Something about how many warriors were staying behind, something about how far the defensive line was from the creche. The young guard answered him quickly, distracted, already turning to follow the others. "Enough," he said. "We have enough." Nathan did not look convinced. He went back to his work, but slower now, his eyes flicking often toward the outer fence, toward the tree line beyond it, where the light was starting to change in a way that had nothing to do with the sun. I did not know it then, but he had already begun counting the exits. He had already begun deciding, without a single claw or fang to his name, what he would do if the number of warriors around us turned out to be wrong. By midday, the wind shifted, carrying with it a smell that even I, young as I was, recognized as wrong. It was the smell of too many bodies moving together, the smell of hunger, with nothing behind it but instinct. My littermates went still around me, ears swiveling toward the fence, small growls building in throats too young to know what a real fight even meant. The 2 young guards exchanged a look I would never forget. It was the look of 2 people realizing, all at once, that they were standing very far from help. Nathan set down his tools. He did not run. He did not call for the guards to handle it while he found somewhere safe to hide, the way any sensible prey creature should have done, the way every instinct in his soft, clawless, fangless body should have been screaming at him to do. Instead, he walked toward the creche pit, toward us, and began pulling the loose fence panels closed with his bare hands, working faster than I had ever seen him move before. That was the last quiet moment before everything changed. I did not know it then, but the sound of those metal panels sliding into place was the beginning of a story that would outlive every single one of us who lived through it, a story that would be carved, quite literally, into the steel of every blade my people would ever carry again. The wind kept shifting. The smell kept getting stronger, and somewhere beyond the tree line, the swarm that was supposed to be 3 days out was already much, much closer than anyone at that outpost had believed. The first of the creatures came through the tree line before the fence panels were even fully closed. They were low, fast things, built for the open plains, with matted hides the color of dead grass and jaws that hung open even when they were not attacking, as if hunger had permanently reshaped their faces. There were perhaps a dozen in that first wave, though more howls rose from deeper in the trees, telling us the rest of the pack was not far behind. The 2 young guards moved to meet them at the fence line, spears raised, voices cracking with the effort of sounding braver than they felt. I remember watching through a gap in the closing panels, my littermates pressed against my sides, all of us too frightened to make a sound. The guards fought well for as long as they could. They were young, but they were Kareth, and even young Kareth are dangerous. The first creature that lunged at the fence was met with a spear through its shoulder, and it fell back howling, dragging 2 others down with it in the chaos. For a moment, I let myself believe that would be enough, that the guards would hold the line, and the creche would stay safe, and Nathan would go back to his tools once the danger passed. That belief did not last long. The pack was larger than anyone had guessed, and smarter than feral things had any right to be. While the guards fought the creatures at the front of the fence, a second group broke off and circled wide, moving low through a drainage ditch that ran along the eastern edge of the creche wall, a blind spot no one had thought to watch closely enough. I heard the metal groan before I saw them. The fence panel Nathan had closed only minutes earlier buckled inward as 3 of the creatures threw their weight against it at once. He was already moving before it gave way completely, shoving a support beam against the gap, bracing it with his own body, shouting something toward the guards that I could not make out over the growing noise. The guards could not hear him. They were too far away, too deep in their own fight, and by the time one of them turned to look, the eastern panel had already torn free. I will never forget the sound it made. Metal tearing is not loud in the way you might expect. It is a low groaning shriek, almost like something alive, and it was the last quiet warning any of us got, before the creatures poured through the gap. There were 5 of them, moving fast, low to the ground, eyes fixed on the pit where my littermates and I stood frozen. In the wild, cubs that age would already have been taught to run, to scatter, to make themselves harder targets. But we had never faced anything like this before. We had only ever fought with each other, tumbling harmlessly in the dust. None of us knew how to survive a real attack. Nathan did. He moved between us and the breach before the first creature had even fully cleared the fence. He had no weapon, not really, only a length of pipe he had grabbed from his scattered tools, but he held it the way I would later learn soldiers hold a blade, steady, low, ready. The first creature lunged at him, and he swung the pipe hard across its skull, hard enough to send it sprawling sideways into the dirt. It did not get back up right away. The second one came in low, trying to slip past him toward the pit, and he stepped sideways to block its path, taking the full weight of its charge against his own body rather than let it pass. I heard him grunt with the impact. I saw him stumble, catch himself, plant his feet again. He did not fall. Do you understand what that means, among my people? A Kareth warrior expects pain. We are built for it, armored in muscle and thick hide, trained from birth to absorb a hit and keep fighting. Nathan Cole had none of that. His skin was thin. His bones were not reinforced by anything but ordinary human biology. Every strike that landed on him should have put him on the ground, and yet he kept rising, kept placing himself back between us and the creatures, again and again, as if his body had simply decided it was not allowed to stop. The 2 young guards finally broke free of their own fight and came running toward the breach, shouting warnings, weapons raised. But they were still too far, and the creatures were already inside the fence, already circling, already testing the edges of the pit where we cubs huddled together, too terrified to do anything but press closer to one another. Nathan planted himself directly in front of the gap in our small barricade, the only real opening left, and did not move. One of the creatures snapped at his leg, and he brought the pipe down across its back before it could close its jaws. Another circled behind him, and he turned just enough to catch it with a kick that sent it tumbling into the dirt, though I could see the movement cost him something, a stiffness in the way he caught his breath afterward. I was close enough to see the moment one of the creatures finally landed a real strike against him. It came low and fast, catching his side, and I watched him stagger, one hand pressing briefly against the wound before he forced himself upright again. He did not cry out. He did not look toward us, did not let any fear show on his face where we might see it. He simply reset his stance and kept his eyes on the creatures in front of him. I think that was the moment I stopped being afraid of him falling and started being afraid of what it would mean if he did. The guards reached the breach at last, spears driving into the remaining creatures with the trained precision of Kareth warriors, and for a moment the fight tipped in our favor. Two of the creatures fell back, wounded, retreating toward the tree line. A third turned and fled entirely, some ancient survival instinct overriding its hunger. But two remained, cornered now, more desperate and more dangerous for it, and they turned their full attention toward the only barrier still standing between them and the cubs in the pit, toward Nathan. He was breathing hard by then. I could see it in the rise and fall of his chest, hear it in the ragged edge of his breath. The wound at his side had darkened the fabric of his shirt, and his grip on the pipe had loosened slightly, as if his hands were growing tired in a way they had never been tired before. One of the guards called out to him, telling him to fall back, that they had it handled now, that he had done enough. Nathan did not fall back. I understand now why he made that choice, though at the time I only understood fear. The two remaining creatures were positioned exactly wrong for the guards to reach in time. If Nathan stepped aside, even for a moment, there would be a gap, and cubs that age do not wait patiently for adults to finish fighting. We are curious. We are frightened. We move without thinking. Any one of us could have bolted in exactly the wrong direction, straight into the path of a wounded and desperate creature with nothing left to lose. So instead of stepping aside, he stepped forward. He met the first creature head-on, taking the brunt of its charge against his own body again, wrapping one arm around its neck to keep its jaws away from his throat, while he drove the end of the pipe into its side with the other. It shrieked and thrashed, and for a long, terrible moment, the two of them were tangled together in the dirt, and I could not tell if he was still moving or not. The second creature saw its opening and lunged toward the pit. I remember the sound I made, some high, frightened cry that was not quite a word, and I remember my littermates scattering around me, small bodies pressing into corners, trying to make themselves invisible against the barricade walls. The creature was fast, faster than anything I had ever seen move, and there was no guard close enough, no warrior fast enough, to stop it before it reached us. Nathan reached it first. He threw himself sideways, putting his own body directly in the creature's path, and I watched him take the full force of its attack meant for one of us. I did not see everything that happened in that moment. My eyes were too full of fear and too young to process it clearly, but I remember the sound, low and pained, and I remember him staying down this time, one hand still gripping the pipe even as it slipped from his fingers. The guards finished the fight seconds later. The remaining creatures either fell or fled, and an uneasy silence settled over the outpost, broken only by the ragged breathing of exhausted warriors and the frightened whimpers of cubs who had just learned, far too young, what real danger looked like. I remember crawling out from behind the barricade panel where I had been hiding, my legs shaking beneath me, and finding Nathan lying near the breach in the fence, unmoving, the wound at his side far worse than I had understood in the chaos of the fight. He was still breathing. I remember that clearly, the small rise and fall of his chest, slower now, more labored than before. His eyes found mine, and even then, even hurt as badly as he was, he tried to smile, tried to say something reassuring in that quiet, steady voice I had known my whole short life. I did not understand the words. I only understood that something was very wrong, and that the guards were already shouting for help, already moving toward him with the kind of urgency I had only ever seen used for wounded warriors, never for someone my people had once dismissed as nothing more than talking meat. They carried him to the outpost's medical bay, moving faster than I had ever seen Kareth warriors move for anything that was not a battle. I followed as far as they would let me, my littermates trailing behind, none of us quite understanding why our small chests felt so tight, why the sight of him lying so still made something ache inside us that had no name yet. The main defensive force returned before nightfall, called back early once word of the breach reached the front line. Draeth was among the first through the gate, his armor still marked from his own fight against the larger swarm, and I remember the look on his face when he learned what had happened at the creche while he was away. He did not say anything cruel that day. I think, looking back, that was the first sign of what was coming. Draeth, who had mocked Nathan for having no claws, no fangs, no blooded name, stood outside the medical bay in silence, his expression unreadable, while healers worked to save the life of the human he had once called nothing more than useful meat. I was too young to understand the medicine, the machines, the quiet, urgent voices of the healers moving in and out of that room. I only understood that hours passed, and then more hours, and the whole outpost seemed to hold its breath waiting for news. I want to tell this next part carefully, because it is the part that changed everything, and I do not want to rush past it, the way fear made me want to rush past it when I was young. Nathan Cole had taken wounds that day that no human body was built to survive easily. The creature he had wrapped his arms around, the one he fought hardest to keep away from the pit, had struck deep before the guards finally drove it back. He had kept fighting anyway. He had kept standing anyway. He had thrown himself into the path of the second creature, the one heading straight for us cubs, knowing exactly what that choice would cost him, and he had made it without hesitation. The healers worked through the night. I remember sitting outside the medical bay with my littermates, none of us sleeping, none of us willing to leave, even when the older Kareth tried gently to guide us back toward the creche. We had never felt anything like this before. We were too young to have words for grief, too young to understand why the thought of losing him felt so much larger than anything else we had ever feared. Sometime near dawn, one of the healers stepped out of the medical bay, and I remember the way every warrior in that hallway turned toward her at once, the way even Draeth, who had spent his whole life proving he needed nothing and no one, leaned forward slightly, waiting. "He is alive," she said, "but only just, and I do not know if he will stay that way through the day. I do not have the words, even now, to describe what the following hours felt like. Time moved strangely, stretched thin and heavy all at once. I remember pressing myself against the wall outside his room, listening to the quiet murmur of the healers, watching shadows move across the floor as the sun rose and climbed and began to fall again. Nathan drifted in and out of awareness during that time. I was allowed to see him only once, briefly, guided by one of the healers who must have understood, better than the adult warriors did, how much this human meant to a group of frightened cubs who had no other way to make sense of what had happened. He looked so small in that bed, smaller than I remembered him being when he stood between us and the creatures. His skin had gone pale in a way that frightened me, and there were tubes and machines surrounding him that I did not understand, all humming quietly, keeping something alive that should not have survived what he had done. He saw me standing there, and even through the pain I could see clearly on his face, he found enough strength to speak. "Are the others safe?" he asked, his voice barely more than a breath. I did not fully understand the question, not with my young grasp of his language, but I understood the shape of it well enough. He was asking about my littermates. Even then, even barely alive, the first thing on his mind was whether the cubs he had bled for were still safe. I managed to say yes, one of the only human words I knew clearly at the time, and something in his face eased, just slightly, as if that single answer was worth more to him than his own survival. The healer guided me out shortly after that, worried the visit was tiring him too much, and I spent the rest of that day and the following night in a kind of numb waiting that I had never experienced before and have rarely experienced since. He did not die that night. I want to say that clearly, because I know some versions of this story, the ones told badly around careless fires, get this part wrong. Nathan Cole did not die in the medical bay. His body, fragile as it was by our standards, held on through that first terrible night, and the healers began to speak, cautiously, of the possibility that he might recover. But recovery, for him, was never going to mean returning to what he was before. The wounds he took that day left permanent damage. I did not understand the details as a cub, only the way the adults spoke about it in hushed, careful tones, the way words like never fully heal and lasting harm passed between the healers when they thought we were not listening closely. He lived. That much is true, and it matters, because so many versions of this story forget that part in favor of something more tragic and more simple. He lived, but he was never quite the same afterward. His body carried the marks of that day for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder written into his own flesh of the choice he made in the space of a few frightened, desperate minutes. I think in some ways that made what happened next even more powerful. This was not a story about a human who gave everything in one final dramatic moment and vanished into legend, clean and distant and untouchable. This was a story about a human who paid a real price, who woke every day afterward carrying the weight of what he had done, and who never once, in all the years I came to know him afterward, spoke of it as anything other than the simplest, most obvious choice in the world. I asked him once, much later, when I was old enough to understand his language properly, why he had done it, why he had stood in the path of something he could not hope to defeat, when every instinct in his body should have told him to run. He was quiet for a long moment before he answered, the kind of quiet that told me he was choosing his words carefully. I looked at the gap in that fence, he said, and I looked at all of you crowded together in that pit, too young to understand what was coming, and I realized there was no version of that moment where I could live with myself if I had simply stepped aside. It was not bravery. It was not some grand decision. It was just the only choice that made any sense to me. That answer stayed with me for the rest of my life, long after that day, long after the outpost, long after Nathan Cole himself had grown old among a people who had once called him nothing more than talking meat, and who came, slowly and completely, to call him something else entirely. But I am getting ahead of the story. Before any of that could happen, my people first had to face something none of us had ever faced before. We had to look honestly at what strength truly meant, and admit that the bravest thing any of us had ever witnessed had come from someone with no claws, no fangs, and no blooded name at all. In the days that followed, the outpost changed in ways I was too young to fully name at the time, though I felt them clearly enough. The warriors who had once walked past Nathan without a second glance now paused when they saw him being moved carefully between the medical bay and a quiet room set aside for his recovery. The ones who had laughed at him, who had called him weak, who had judged him by claws he did not have and fangs he would never grow, now found themselves unable to meet his eyes, not out of anger, but out of something closer to shame. Draeth came to see him on the third day. I was there, sitting quietly near the doorway with my littermates, when the scarred warrior stepped into that small room, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. Nathan was propped up against a stack of cushions, still weak, still marked by bandages that would leave scars for the rest of his life, but awake and aware enough to notice who had come to see him. Draeth stood there for a long moment without speaking, and I remember thinking, even as a cub, that this was strange. Draeth always had something to say. He was loud, certain, quick with judgment. Watching him struggle for words was almost as unsettling as the attack itself had been. "I called you weak," he finally said. "I called you meat." Nathan did not respond right away, and I do not think he needed to. He simply waited, the way he always did, patient in a way that made space for other people to say what they needed to say. "I was wrong," Draeth continued, and every word seemed to cost him something. "I have fought 100 battles. I have taken wounds I bear with pride, but I have never once done what you did. I have never stood alone against odds that should have killed me. for cubs that were not my own, with nothing but a length of pipe and the will not to move. He paused, and then, in a gesture that would have been unthinkable among my people only days earlier, he knelt beside the bed, bringing himself lower than the injured human lying there. "You have a warrior's heart," Draeth said. "Whatever claws or fangs you lack, that heart is worth more than mine." I did not fully understand, in that moment, how significant those words were. I only understood that something important had shifted, that the world I had known before the attack was not quite the same world I was living in now. News of what happened at the creche spread quickly beyond our small outpost. Kareth society does not keep quiet stories quiet for long, especially stories that challenge something as fundamental as what our people believed about strength and worth. Elders from neighboring settlements traveled to hear the account directly from the guards who had witnessed it, from Draeth, from the healers who had fought to keep Nathan alive, and, eventually, from us, from the cubs who had been there. I remember being brought before a gathering of elders for the first time in my young life, standing beside my littermates in a wide stone hall, while gray-furred Kareth, with more scars and more years than I could imagine, studied us with careful, searching eyes. "Tell us what you saw," one of them said, her voice neither unkind nor gentle, simply direct in the way elders often were. I did my best. My words were still clumsy, my understanding of the full event still shaped by fear and confusion, but I told them what I remembered: the fence tearing open, the creatures pouring through, Nathan standing between us and the breach, again and again, refusing to fall back even as his body was pushed past what it could safely endure. I told them about the moment he threw himself into the path of the creature that was heading straight for the pit, taking the wound meant for one of us. The hall was silent for a long time after I finished speaking. Finally, the same elder who had asked me to speak turned to the others gathered around her. "My people have a saying," she said, "one that is older than any of us in this room. Strength is not measured in claws. It is measured in what you are willing to give up for those who cannot yet protect themselves. We have said these words for generations, and yet I wonder, honestly, how many of us truly believed them until now." Another elder, older still, with fur gone almost entirely silver, spoke next. "This human had no claws to give up," he said, "no fangs to lose. He gave something far harder to offer. He gave his own body, knowing full well what it would cost him, for cubs who were not his own, of a species that called him weak to his face, only days before he bled for them." "That is not weakness," the first elder said quietly. "That is the purest form of strength our people have ever named." The debate that followed lasted for weeks, though I understood only fragments of it at the time, my attention still mostly occupied by the simple relief of knowing Nathan would live. Some of the older, more traditional voices resisted the idea that a human, someone outside our own bloodlines and our own warrior traditions, could be honored the way our own fallen and wounded warriors were honored. They argued that Kareth honors belonged to Kareth alone, that opening our traditions to an outsider, however brave, would weaken something sacred about what it meant to be one of us. But those voices grew quieter as more of the story spread, as more elders traveled to see Nathan for themselves, to hear directly from the guards and the healers, and the cubs who had lived through that day. It became harder and harder to argue that the purest example of Kareth virtue anyone had witnessed in a generation should be excluded from Kareth honor simply because it came from someone born outside our bloodlines. It was my own mother, Vessa, matriarch of our clan, and one of the most respected voices among the gathered elders, who finally proposed the solution that would change everything. I remember the day clearly, though I was still too young to understand its full weight. She stood before the assembled elders, her presence commanding the kind of silence that only came from decades of earned respect, and she spoke words that would echo through every generation of Kareth that followed. "We forge blades for every warrior who earns the right to carry one," she said. "We etch the names of the fallen into steel so that their courage travels with us into every fight we ever face again. I say we do the same for this human, not because he was born a predator, not because he carries claws or fangs, But because on the day it mattered most, he acted with more courage, more sacrifice, and more love for cubs that were not his own than any warrior in this hall can honestly claim to have shown. "Let every blade my people carry from this day forward bear his name," she continued. "Let every cub who lifts a sword for the first time learn that name before they learn to hunt. Let them understand, in their bones, that strength without a reason to protect the helpless is nothing but noise. Nathan Cole gave us that reason, written in his own blood, and I will not let my people forget it, simply because he was not born one of us." The hall erupted into a debate louder and more passionate than anything I had witnessed before, but beneath the disagreement, I could feel something shifting, something settling into place that would not easily be undone. By the time the gathering ended, the decision had been made. The first blade was forged within the month, taken from steel recovered from the very fence Nathan had tried to defend, melted down and reshaped by the outpost's finest smiths into something new. Along the fuller of that blade, in careful, deliberate script, they etched his name. I was chosen to receive that first sword, being the eldest among the cubs who had survived that day, and I remember the weight of it in my paws when the smith finally presented it to me, still warm from the forge, the letters of his name catching the light in a way that made them seem almost alive. I did not fully understand, at that age, what I was holding. I only knew that it felt important, heavier than its physical weight alone could explain, as if it carried something of the man himself pressed into every inch of that steel. Nathan was there for the ceremony, still moving slowly, still marked by the wounds that would never fully leave him, but present, watching as the tradition that would define my people for generations to come took its first uncertain steps into existence. He did not say much that day. I remember him watching quietly as the smith explained the meaning behind the blade, as my mother spoke about courage and sacrifice, and the true measure of strength. When it was finally my turn to hold the sword, he knelt beside me, the way Draeth had knelt beside his bed weeks earlier, bringing himself down to my level. "I never wanted a sword named after me," he said quietly, more to himself than to the gathered crowd. "But if it means cubs like you remember that protecting each other matters more than being strong, then I suppose I can live with it." I did not know, in that moment, just how far those words and that tradition would travel. I did not know that the sword I held that day would become the first of thousands, that his name would eventually be carried by every Kareth warrior across every settlement our people called home, or that the small, quiet human who once fixed water pipes and gave cubs river stones as gifts would become the single most honored name in the entire history of my species. I only knew that something had changed in the deepest part of who we were, and that it had started with one person who refused to run when every instinct told him he should. Many years have passed since that morning the fence tore open and a quiet human engineer decided, without hesitation, that a group of frightened cubs mattered more than his own safety. I am no longer the small, trembling creature who hid behind a barricade panel, too frightened to make a sound. I have grown into a full warrior of my people, and the sword I carry at my side, the very first one ever forged in his name, has traveled with me through more battles than I can easily count. I want to tell you what happened after that first ceremony, because the story does not end with a single sword given to a single frightened cub. It grows from there, spreading outward the way a river spreads from its source, touching more lives than any of us standing in that stone hall could have imagined at the time. Word of my mother's decision traveled quickly beyond our own clan. Other settlements, hearing the full account of what Nathan had done, began asking the same question we had already answered for ourselves. What did strength truly mean if the bravest act any of them had heard of came from someone with no claws at all? Within a few short years, the tradition my mother began spread across nearly every Kareth settlement on our world. Smiths in distant clans, who had never met Nathan Cole and would likely never have the chance to, began etching his name into every blade they forged, teaching young cubs his story before those cubs ever lifted a weapon in their own defense. I remember, as a young warrior barely older than my first blooded fight, traveling to a settlement on the far side of our continent and being surprised to find cubs there who could recite the story of that day with more detail and more reverence than I remembered feeling myself, even though none of them had ever met the human at the center of it. They called him, simply, the fallen guardian, though he had not fallen in the way that phrase usually implied. He had not died that day. He had done something harder, in some ways. He had lived, carrying the weight and the scars of his choice for the rest of his life, waking every morning afterward with a body that would never fully forget what it had endured, protecting creatures that were not his own kind. I think that detail mattered more than most people realized, once the story had traveled far enough to become something closer to legend. It would have been easy, in the retelling, for Nathan Cole to become a distant, perfect figure, a name attached to a single dramatic moment and nothing more. But he remained among us, living proof that courage was not a myth reserved for songs and old stories. He walked among Kareth warriors for decades afterward, quiet and unassuming as he had always been, never once treating his own name on our blades as anything more than an unusual and slightly uncomfortable honor. I visited him often as I grew older, drawn back to that outpost whenever my duties allowed it. He had grown gray by then, his movements slower, his body carrying the permanent marks of that single terrible afternoon, but his eyes remained the same steady riverstone color I remembered from my earliest memories. He never grew comfortable with the way my people spoke of him. I remember him laughing, quiet, and a little embarrassed, the first time he saw a young Kareth warrior kneel before him the way one might kneel before an elder or a respected teacher. "I only did what anyone should have done," he told me once, sitting outside his small home near the edge of the outpost, the same tools he had always favored laid out neatly beside him, even in his later years. I do not understand why that earned songs and swords and cubs kneeling in front of me like I am something more than I am. I remember answering him honestly, the way only someone who had grown up carrying his name into battle after battle could answer. "Because you are right that anyone should have done it," I told him, "but you are the only one who actually did, when it mattered most, and my people needed to be reminded that such a thing was possible." He did not have a response for that, not right away. He simply nodded, quiet and thoughtful, and let the silence settle comfortably between us, the way it always had, even from the earliest days I remembered him. The relationship between our two species changed in ways that went far beyond a single tradition of naming blades. Humans, once dismissed by so many of my people as soft, weak, unworthy prey, found themselves welcomed differently at every Kareth settlement that heard the story. Trade agreements that had once been reluctant and suspicious grew into genuine partnerships. Human engineers, doctors, and diplomats found themselves treated with a respect that would have seemed impossible only a generation earlier. It was not instant, and it was not universal. Some among my people still clung to the old ways of judging worth, purely by claw and fang, and I will not pretend that every Kareth settlement embraced this change with open arms. But the direction was set, undeniable, moving steadily towards something better than what had come before, and it all traced back to one quiet human who refused to step aside when a gap opened in a fence, and cubs stood frightened on the other side. I carried my sword through my own trials as a young warrior, through my own battles against creatures and rivals and dangers that tested every skill I had been taught. And every single time I drew that blade, every single time I felt its weight settle into my grip before a fight, I found myself thinking of the name etched along its fuller, of the steady voice that had once told a frightened cub the meaning of the word keepsake. There came a day, many years after that first attack, when I found myself standing in almost the exact position Nathan Cole had once stood in. I was stationed at a border settlement much like the one where I had grown up, tasked with watching over a creche of young cubs while the main defensive force was drawn away to deal with a distant threat. The attack that came was smaller than the one I remembered from my own childhood, a handful of feral creatures rather than a full swarm, but the fear in the eyes of the cubs around me was exactly the same, and the gap in our defenses opened just as suddenly and just as dangerously as it had all those years before. I did not hesitate. I do not think I could have, even if some part of me had wanted to. I drew my sword, the very first one forged in Nathan's name, and placed myself between the breach and the cubs behind me, exactly where he had once stood with nothing more than a length of pipe and an unwillingness to move. I fought that day with claws and fangs and steel that he never had, advantages he never possessed, and yet I found myself thinking, in the middle of that fight, that none of those advantages mattered nearly as much as the simple decision underneath them, the decision to stand, the decision to protect something smaller and more frightened than yourself, whatever the cost. We won that fight without losing a single cub, and when it was over, I found myself kneeling in the dirt, much the way Drath had once knelt beside Nathan's bed, catching my breath, feeling the weight of the sword still gripped tightly in my hand. I ran my thumb along the letters of his name, worn smooth now by years of use, and I whispered the words I had come to say before every battle I ever fought, the same words that had spread, along with the tradition itself, to every Kareth warrior across our world. For the ones who cannot yet protect themselves. That is the phrase carved beneath his name, on every blade we forge now, the meaning behind the tradition my mother began in that stone hall so many years ago. It is not simply a name we carry into battle. It is a reminder, etched permanently into the steel we depend on, of what true strength actually means. Nathan Cole lived a long life among my people, longer than any of us who witnessed that first terrible day truly expected, given the extent of his injuries. He never became a warrior himself, never grew claws or fangs or any of the things my people once believed made someone worthy of respect. He remained, until the very end, a quiet engineer who preferred fixing pipes to accepting praise, uncomfortable with songs sung in his honor, embarrassed by cubs who knelt before him as though he were something more than human. But every Kareth who ever lifted a blade bearing his name understood, in a way words alone could never fully capture, exactly how much more than human he truly was. I think of him often now, especially in quiet moments before a fight, when the weight of the sword in my hand reminds me of everything that name represents. I think of a small stone gift pressed into a cub's paw. I think of a fence tearing open and a quiet human refusing to run. I think of a body that never fully healed, carried willingly into pain for creatures that were not his own kind, by someone who never once believed he had done anything extraordinary at all. That, perhaps, is the truest measure of what he gave us. Not the sword, not the tradition, not even the courage itself, remarkable as it was. It was the simple, unshakable belief that protecting the helpless was never a choice worth debating. It was only ever the obvious thing to do. Every predator among my people carries his name now, etched into the steel we trust with our lives, and every time that steel is drawn in defense of something smaller and more frightened than ourselves, some small part of Nathan Cole stands with us still, exactly where he first chose to stand, between danger and those who could not yet protect themselves.